Let's pray. Father, as we are gathered here this morning, we have come to praise and to worship, and most important, just to give you honor. And Father, as we will be looking into your word, I pray that your word will just speak to our hearts as we have just lifted our lives before you. It truly is our desire to worship you, that every breath we take would bring honor and glory to you, for you truly are worthy. Thank you for just leading us to your throne today. And Father, I just pray that you would just continue to speak to us, for I ask this in Jesus' name. Amen. Well, welcome. Glad to have you with us this morning. And as you know, we have been going through the book of Proverbs over the last number of weeks. And if you remember back, you will know that we've taken some time to look at some specific topics from the book of Proverbs. For example, we looked at the importance of wisdom. And then we went on, we talked about how do we go about acquiring wisdom within our lives. And then also we looked at how do you apply wisdom in trying to make wise decisions. And then last week, if I remember right, Ray, you talked about making wisdom, Jesus himself, the foundation of your life. And it's important that we do this and that we have this. And yet, as much as it's important for us to in a sense, apply wisdom and to use wisdom in making decisions, God also wants us to use wisdom to affect our actions and our behavior in our daily lives. And when you get into the book of Proverbs, you will find out that in reality, it's full of gems just for us. It gives us principles upon which to base our daily lives. And so this morning, what I want us to do is just take some time, and we're going to be looking primarily at Proverbs chapter 20, and looking at ways, some principles that are presented there to help us to live out our daily lives, and those principles that we need to apply. Now, since it starts in verse 1 with a touchy subject, I thought I'd tackle the tough one first, all right? So we're going to look at this subject and just kind of follow along with me and let's see what it says, all right? So the first one talks about drinking beer and wine. All right, okay, here we go. Wine is a mocker and beer a brawler. Whoever is led astray by them is not wise. All right. Show of hands. Is it okay to drink beer and wine? Biblically. Does the Bible give us basis? We have a lot of abstainers in the audience today. That's great. I mean, it's okay. All right. I actually believe that the Bible, the Bible doesn't teach total abstinence. Okay, now let me preface that, okay? Because in reality, when you look at this verse and other verses, the key here is the idea of being led astray. I think it talks about having an indulgence. And I know if you go back into biblical times, the wine and beer that they drank probably didn't have the alcohol content that we have today. It wasn't necessarily distilled. It was home brewed. And so you have some of those things that are involved in it. But I think if you look through, and especially even in the book of Proverbs and in the Old Testament, wine was used in a number of festivals and things like that. And if you go back to chapter 3, it talks here of drinking being allowed but not being misused. Because in chapter 3 it says that if we honor God with our wealth, if we give to him first of the first fruits, he goes on and he says that part of the blessing that we will receive will be that our vats will brim over with new wine. And it's kind of like, okay, it's there. But here's the thing, and this is key. Just grab a hold of this. Proverbs also gives us a list of warnings about overindulgence, of drinking too much wine, or too much beer, of allowing it to affect our lives. And that's what we want to look at this morning, because it really does give us some warnings. So the first warning that I came across is jump ahead to chapter 23. And here it says this: "Listen, my son, and be wise, and set your heart on the right path. Do not join those who drink too much wine, or gorge themselves on meat. For drunkards and gluttons become poor, and drowsiness clothes those in rags, or them in rags. Now, when I was a missionary in Bolivia, I saw this verse in reality. A lot of times, people would spend a couple of months, 2 or 3 months, of their salary to buy beer and food for a special festival or an anniversary or a wedding or something like that. And they would just be in poverty. And what would be interesting was that when one of those people would become a believer, when they would put their trust in Jesus Christ, a lot of times they would stop drinking altogether. And I think part of the reason was because of the way that it was being used. And the other thing was, too, that there, you just didn't have social drinking. I think we use that term here. I mean, you basically drank to get drunk. And so you would have that. And so they would basically pull totally away from all alcohol. And what was amazing to me is that I could go into a small village out, in the boondocks someplace, and I could point to a couple of people who were believers because their house was in better array. Their kids actually had nice clothes to wear. So in other words, instead of spending all of their money on beer and food for these festivals and things like that, they would take that money and they would improve their homes and buy clothes for their kids. In other words, this verse was true, that too much wine, too much of this can lead to poverty, and I actually saw that firsthand. A second warning that comes out in the same chapter talks about this in verse 29 and 30. Who has woes, or who has woe, who has sorrow, who has strife, who has complaints, who has needless bruises, who has bloodshot eyes? Those who linger over wine, who go to sample bowls of mixed wine. And again, here we see that the warning comes out with the idea that wine can just lead to all kinds of conflict and problems and issues. It can even sometimes lead to violence. I mean, you'll see that happen. And so Proverbs is really trying to say to us, listen, be very careful. If you drink, be very careful in how you do it. Don't linger over it. And then one last one that came out to me, again, this is jumping way ahead into chapter 31. Listen to what it says here. It says, it is not for kings, Lemuel, it is not for kings to drink wine, not for rulers to crave beer, lest they drink and forget what has been decreed and deprive all the oppressed of their rights. Do you see what this verse is saying? There's two things that jumped out at me when I read this. First of all, that when you drink, it can affect your judgment, your ability, in a sense, to have wise decisions and to, sometimes forget things and just move on like that. But the other thing that came out to me in this was that who is this addressed to? Kings and rulers. And as I looked at that, it kind of hit me like, okay, as a leader within the church, and even as a missionary, one of the things I made, and I took a stand, and I still take it today, is that I do abstain from alcohol. And part of it was a culture in Bolivia. It was like, I don't want to be drunk. I don't want to come across that way at all. But also the other thing was, I don't want others to say, oh, look, Pastor Tim drinks, so it's fine for me to drink. And I didn't want that to happen, especially in Bolivia. We did not want to give them any reason whatsoever because we knew what it led to. And so because of that, I've taken that stand. Now, I'm not condemning anybody who does drink. I've sat with people who drink and they've offered me one, and I said, no, that's fine. I mean, I don't have an issue with that. What I have an issue with, and what I think Proverbs has an issue with, is this, that we are not to become drunk. If you drink, be very, very careful. Don't drink to the place where you become intoxicated. Stop before you get there. And then also, do not use it as an escape for life's problems, because I see that way too often, that people drink alcohol just to try and escape. Because in reality, when we do that, we don't escape life's problems. We actually, in a sense, compound those problems more so in our lives. All right? So Proverbs is telling us to be very, very careful when it comes to this idea of drinking wine and beer. All right, a second principle then that kind of comes out, and I'm not going to cover a whole bunch. I picked about 3 or 4. If you go through the book of Proverbs, I mean, you will find tons. I mean, Proverbs talks about issues about being, a parent, counseling. It talks about leadership. It talks about finances. There's a bunch of them. I'm just hitting a couple of them because I took the first one because it was in verse 1, and then I jumped down to the next one, which is talking about interpersonal relationships. And this is something I think we need to take a look at. It says in verse 3 of chapter 20, "It's to one's honor to avoid strife, but every fool is quick to quarrel." You catch that one? I mean, that's a pretty good one. Now, here he's not saying we're to avoid conflict, but he's basically saying don't jump into an argument too quick. Don't quarrel over minors. I think sometimes we need wisdom to determine, okay, is this really something I have to confront? Is this something that I really have to work with? Yes, we do have to take care of situations and problems, but there are some people, they just love jumping in and throwing in, just to get people riled up and things like that. And he says, don't do that. Don't do that. Just take an easy road in that sense. And, don't avoid conflict, but don't add to it. And then secondly, he talks there, a couple of verses down in verse 19, he says, "A gossip betrays a confidence. So avoid anyone who talks too much." Am I talking too much this morning? Okay. All right. What's he saying here? He's saying, listen, you need to understand that a gossip can destroy your reputation. You put your confidence into someone and you say to them, man, I'm really struggling in this area in my life. And you say it in confidence. So what happens? There's a tweet that goes out, right? And all of a sudden, man, everybody in the world knows what you're struggling with. He is saying be very careful in picking your friends, and especially those that you put your trust in. Don't put it in the hands of a gossip. It'll come back to bite you big time. And so even in interpersonal relationships, just on a one-to-one basis, Proverbs provides us with some pretty neat and interesting things. Then he goes on, and another one that I picked up came talking about a proper work ethic. And here he says, "Sluggards do not plow in season, so at harvest time they look but find nothing." Now, you know what a sluggard is? It's a person who just kind of doesn't do anything, all right? Just kind of backs off and expects things, okay, well, I'm not going to plow now, but, come harvest time, I'll have something. No. We have to have a proper work ethic. And he goes on and he says then in verse 13, "Do not love sleep, or you will grow poor. Stay awake, and you will have food to spare." Now, I'm not going to say a whole lot here, because I know next week Pastor Lou's going to be covering a little bit of this, and so I don't want to take too much away from him. But I think what these verses are saying is that we need to be careful, that we do have a work ethic, that we do work. But let me just preface it here by saying all of us need some white space in our calendars. You know what I mean by that? If you have a day timer and whatever, it's all full. I mean, I've seen some calendars that are just all colored. No. You need to have some white space. God expects us to have rest and to recuperate and to have some recreation. That's part of why he has created the Sabbath for us to have. But here's what the writer of Proverbs is saying. Yeah, you need to have some white space. But if your whole calendar is white, okay, that's the problem. All right, that's the issue that he's talking about. All right, so then he goes into that. Now, the next area I want to talk about, and this is where I'm going to kind of finish up and kind of spend a little bit of time, is the idea of having correct business practices. Proverbs really talks a lot about how we should handle a business, what we should do. And the way that they do it, and the author has done it, is he actually puts it in the negative. He basically says, this is not the way to run a business. Okay, you got that? This is not the way to operate in the business world. So he gives us the negative. So let's take a look at some of the negative things that he says. He says, first of all, differing weights and differing measures. The Lord detests them both. And then a little bit further on, in verse 23, he says, the Lord detests differing weights, and dishonest scales do not please him. Now, if you read this in the Hebrew, it's even more confusing. And it's kind of like, what do you mean, differing weights, differing measures? What are you talking about here? And this is sometimes where we have to go a little bit deeper. Look back at the cultural context of what was happening at this time. During this time, in biblical times, a lot of times vendors would use a scale that they would hold that would have your produce on one side and weights on the other. Here's a picture. Can you kind of see that? All right. And, a guy holds it up and he's got some weights on one side and then he's got some, fruit or something on the other side. And when we were in Bolivia, and you were in the market, you would often have people do this. We'd have this weight, and they'd put on a weight on one side, and then you maybe buy some green beans or something, okay? And they pile them up on the other side, and when it balanced, then you've got, your 500 kilograms, or no, 500 grams, not kilograms, 500 grams of green beans, all right? But here's what they would do. If you weren't watching, sometimes they'd actually take their little finger and kind of hold up to one side, okay? The weights were all right, but they were just kind of, cheating you a little bit here. Or they would actually kind of dig out underneath the weight. The weight looked good on the outside, but when you put it on, you got home and you're going like, 500 grams? This is like about 300 grams, okay? I mean, you would run into that and you would have that. And what he's talking about here is saying, yeah, the Lord detests that. He hates it when you try and cheat people. Now, okay, yeah, I can do this. Have you noticed when you go to the grocery store that you're paying the same price for a bag of potato chips or cereal? Bags are the same size, but the quantity is a whole lot less. Have you guys noticed that at all? Noticed it? Okay, I asked Ray to bring me a bag of chips here, okay? All right, some nice Tostitos with lime, all right? Look at that, full bag of chips for you, right? Can you see that out there? Isn't that great? You're paying for a full bag of chips. Okay, ready? Watch this. Can you see that now? See the silver? Not one chip to be seen. You just bought a half bag of chips. All right? You see, that's kind of what they're doing. I mean, I can remember when it used to be pretty full. Now it's almost a half bag. And it's this type of thing where I think sometimes, I don't know if I'd call that cheating, but it's just kind of like, fudging a little bit, making you think you're getting more than what you're really getting. And I think that's what this is saying here. That often in business practices, you'll see people who will fudge on something. They say that you'll get this product and it's a inferior one or something like that. Or sometimes you will go. This happened to me. I was had to get an emissions test, for your car. How you have to get that done. And I went to this car place to get it done, and they came back and they said to me, oh, we checked your fluids. I thought, okay, yeah, and you need to change your transmission fluid. It's really bad. Oh, okay, let me think on that one. Okay, and they gave me a price, $150, $200 to change my fluids. I went home and I went back into my records of my car, and I actually had my transmission fluid changed 6 months before going there. Anything like that ever happen to you? What are they trying to do? They're trying to cheat you, okay, out of that. And that leads into the next thing, which is really kind of, in a sense, dealing with fraud. It says here, dishonest money dwindles away, but whoever gathers money little by little makes it grow. Now, this is the NIV. If you look in different translations, in the ESV it says, wealth gained hastily dwindles away. In the New American Standard, it says, wealth obtained by fraud. And the New Living Testament, it says, wealth from get-rich-quick schemes. All right? This is dealing with this whole thing of, get rich quick, do this, and you'll make lots of money, and it's fraudulent. Pyramid schemes sometimes are like that. Ponzi schemes, give this guy some money and he'll make you lots of money and all this type of stuff. This is dealing with fraud, just outright lying. I mean, they know what they're doing, and they're basically trying to cheat you and do what they can to get your money from you. And so fraud, God hates that. He doesn't want us to do that. It's this idea that, okay, if we say we're doing this service, this is what we're going to do. We're not going to try and get rich quick, get out of those schemes, those types of things, but we actually practice doing things honestly. And then the last one that I kind of saw there in Proverbs talks about this. It says, do not move an ancient boundary stone or encroach on the fields of the fatherless. Now, anybody know what that is referring to?
Changing the line where your property and making it bigger.
Right, okay. Today, in this day and age, we don't use stones necessarily. We use metal stakes that are actually in the ground, or even wooden stakes. This principle comes from Deuteronomy back in the Old Testament, where they actually laid up stones that as a family you were given a certain portion of land, and they would put up stones. And so Moses said way back here in Deuteronomy, he says, do not move your neighbor's boundary stone set up by your predecessors in the inheritance you receive in the land of the Lord your God is giving to you to possess. In other words, it's this idea that, okay, I take this stone, all right, and okay, I'm going to go this way with it, okay? Now I've just increased my land and taken it away from my neighbor. What's that? Stealing. Yeah, it's just outright stealing, just taking from somebody else. And he's saying that, yeah, you see that happen in business practices, that people will just steal. I mean, they'll just take things, and they'll do that. And the second part of this is that encroach on the fields of the fatherless. Here it's talking about taking advantage of the vulnerable. When I was a pastor in Gormley a number of years ago, I had a person that was a friend of mine that was just a little mentally slow, and he came to me one time and he asked me for a loan. And I thought, that's really kind of strange, because he's usually pretty good about handling his money. And what was even more strange, it was at the beginning of the month, and I know that he had just received his payment at the end of the month. And I said, so why do you need a loan? Why are you without money? He said, well, I was over at the convenience store and I spent my money. And I said, you spent your money at the convenience store? How did you spend your money at the convenience store? What were you buying? He kind of put his head down. He said, I spent it on some of those break open ticket things you get at the store. I said, what happened? Well, there's a jar there, and they had all these tickets in it, and I just thought maybe I'd try one. And I bought one, and I won $5. Oh. And I got so excited thinking I could win more money, I kept buying tickets until I realized I had spent all I had. Now, I usually am pretty constrained, but I jumped in my car and I went to that convenience store. And I tore into that clerk. What were you thinking? Why were you doing that? Don't you realize you're taking advantage of this guy? You know the response I got? Really? Really? God hates this. He does not want us to take advantage of those people who are vulnerable. And I think this is, we need to do these things. Now, as I thought about this, my mind went to this thing that, correct business practices, they have to be based on honesty, integrity. I mean, everything needs to be above board. Everything. Okay? Dealings under the table. We see that happen all the time. If you give me cash, I don't have to declare it, and I can take off the taxes. All these little things are there, okay? And so as I thought about that, my mind went to this. I mean, really, now come on, let's be honest. Can we really have a business survive, thrive even, in this society, in this day and age, by using biblical principles? Is it really possible? Or do we have to go along with the rest of the world and kind of fudge here, there, a little bit? Is it possible? Well, let me give you an illustration of a company that I think is maybe doing that. Anybody hear of this organization? Chick-fil-A, okay? They've been in the news in recent times, and we'll get into that. But let me just give you a little bit of history of this. Chick-fil-A was actually started by a guy by the name of S. Truett Cathy. Back in 1946, he opened a little restaurant with his brother Bob, and they called it the Dwarf Grill. And they changed it, I think, to the Dwarf House then after that. But you know what a dwarf is, a little guy like that? He actually used his kids in costumes, okay, dwarf costumes, and they would sing as people would come into the restaurant. Yeah, it was pretty embarrassing. And anyhow, he started this cafe, and one of the specialties that he started way back then was to make a chicken sandwich, to use chicken meat. Everybody was making hamburgers, right? But he was one of the first guys to use chicken to make a sandwich. And people would come in, and the business began to grow, and he did quite well. And in 1967, he actually opened his first Chick-fil-A. He changed the name, probably for the better part, from Dwarf to Chick-fil-A. And he opened up a restaurant. And as he began to do that, he set this as their corporate purpose. And this is right from their website. Their purpose is to glorify God by being faithful steward of all that is entrusted to us, and to have a positive influence on all who come into contact with Chick-fil-A. That is their purpose. They run their business to glorify God, to be faithful steward of all that God has entrusted to them, and to have a positive influence on everybody that comes into their restaurant. Now, does anybody know one of the biblical principles that they follow to this day, besides taking a stand on biblical marriage? He's gotten into some trouble because of that stance, but there's another thing that they do to this day.
Honor the Sabbath.
They're not open on Sunday. Okay? A restaurant that's not open on Sunday. Can you imagine that? In this day and age, why would you not open on Sunday? None of their restaurants are open. They actually have a restaurant inside the Atlanta Falcons football team stadium, closed on Sunday. Can you imagine? Why would they do that? This is from their website. Truett was saying, having worked 7 days a week in restaurants open 24 hours, Truett saw the importance of closing on Sundays so that he and his employees could set aside one day to rest and to worship if they chose. And it's a practice we uphold to this day. They've expanded on that a little bit, and if you look at their website, they'll say that it's basically to give people a time to rest, and it's giving them a time to be with their families and to worship if they want to. But now here's something you need to understand about Chick-fil-A. Even though they're closed on Sunday, they have done a couple of things on a Sunday. In December of 2017, there was a power outage in Atlanta, and it affected the airport, and people were stranded. It was middle of December 16th, 17th, someplace in there. The mayor called the owner, who's now his son Dan, and said, "Is there anything you could do?" He said, "Yeah, we could do something." He called some of his guys who work right around the Atlanta airport. They got together, and they cooked up 2,000 sandwiches and bottles of water and went to the airport and gave them to people who were stranded. Okay? I know that they have been condemned, especially Dan, for some of the things he has said concerning gay marriage. And some of the money they actually gave to some organizations, he's backed off on some of that because he realized it was not right in doing that. But he still takes a biblical stand. Marriage is between a man and a woman. I mean, he's solid on that. He's not discriminatory in any sense of the word, as far as I can see. And to show that, do you remember, this was back in 2016, in Orlando, Florida. A gay bar was busted into and 46, 49 people were killed. That Sunday, a number of the restaurants in that area got together and they produced sandwiches and beverages, and they brought them out for the first responders and for anybody who was offering blood. The restaurant stayed closed, but they actually went out when there was a need to provide for those in the community. Now, listen to what his son actually says concerning this practice of not opening on Sundays. Can you pull that up there for me, Mike?
I know in our business with Chick-fil-A, my dad made the commitment back in 1946 that it would be closed on Sunday. Sometimes we're asked the question, well, what does it cost you by being closed on Sunday? Operationally, we just perform better. I like to say that our food tastes better on Monday because we're closed on Sunday. And so this is just like many biblical truths and principles that on the surface, they're kind of counterintuitive. They don't immediately make sense. But it's when you live let out, then you kind of have a breakthrough moment and you find that, hey, this really does work. My dad says that being closed on Sunday was the best business decision that he ever made. Wow. One of the metaphors.
Okay, did you catch that? What did he say? One of the best business decisions we ever made was to do what? Be closed on Sundays. A biblical principle that he applied to their business. It was the best business decision they'd ever made. And I wondered about that. Really? Are you sure about that? So I did some research, and I went to a website called Inc.com. It deals with businesses. And the author there was saying, he got the statistics, in 2016, the average sales per store, all right, so each store sold an average of 4.4 million pieces of chicken. I mean, that's a lot of chicken, all right, 4.4 million. In comparisons, Kentucky Fried Chicken, okay? See that? 1.1 million. This is what the author said. Chick-fil-A produced 4 times more sales per restaurant and did it while being opened 6 days per week instead of 7. Sounds crazy because it is. In this day and age, who would think of doing that? That's nuts. You're crazy to do that. Do you think maybe God is honoring them for the commitment that they have made? And I think that's where we're trying to get to this today. And what I'm saying to you is that when we put wisdom into action, it may seem kind of strange the way that we look at it. But if we do that, I think God will honor us. And I want to put a challenge out to each one of you. Over this coming month, my challenge is this. I want you to take and read a proverb a day. There's 32 in there. You may have to read 2 on the last day. But, just go through the book of Proverbs. Read a chapter a day. And then kind of make notes. And at the end of the week, write down just one principle that just kind of jumped out at you and say, hey, I'm going to apply that to my life. I'm going to try that out and see what happens. Just one, okay? I don't want you to do 2 or 3, just one a week. So by the end of the month, you'll have 4 principles that you'll be applying to your life. And by doing so, you know what you're doing? You're putting wisdom in action. You're saying, okay, I'm going to try this thing out. And what you're going to find out is this, and again, it's a quote from what Dan just said here. And you can follow, if you want to hear more of what he has to say, he's on Right Now Media. Some of you are tied into that we're offering to you. He has an excellent talk that he gave at a church, and there's just little snippets like this that are just really good. And so you can take a listen to this. His name is Don T. Cathy. And this is what he said. Remember, he said on the surface, he's talking about biblical principles. They are kind of counterintuitive. You know, they don't necessarily make a lot of sense. But when you live them out, you catch that? When you apply them to your life, when you put wisdom into action, you have a breakthrough moment. And guess what? You find out it really does work. All right? Let's pray. Father, I pray that today you would just challenge our hearts to take your word, take that wisdom that is there in your word, and not just think about it, but actually take it and apply some of those principles that you have presented and live them out. Try them. I mean, yeah, it sounds really strange. Like, man, really? We can live that way in this day and age? But Father, give us the courage and the strength that we need to try it. Yeah, it may sound crazy. But yet, this is the way you have created us. This is the way you desire for us to live out our lives. And so I just throw out this challenge, and may we just look at some of these principles and then take one and really work it out, apply it in our life. And as we do that, we will see you work and bless within our lives. So Father, thank you for this amazing book of Proverbs and for all the wisdom that is there for us. Help us not just to gleam over it, but to really apply it to our lives, to allow wisdom really to take action in our daily lives. For I pray and ask this in Jesus' name, amen.